Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting from our Sanctum Sanctorum in Venice, California, this is the Sixth Sense Society. I'm your host, Krista, here with our producer, Michael, and today you're tuning in to Spell It Out, Magic, Reflections, and Shadows, where I take a topic and run with it. So I have 2 more Spell It Outs for the year, and I'm going to be focused mostly on astrology. And what I'm going to be focusing on today, and maybe the next one too, is Mars going to be retrograde in Gemini, which is coming up. But before we get started, Michael has a few announcements.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for working to put up with us for a little bit. We're still working out some of the tech issues from last week, obviously, and so expect this to be a little flawed this week until we get it going, but we're working hard to kind of get everything running right. We've got some great shows coming up. We've got our good friend Krista, the historian from Salem, Massachusetts, to talk about the Salem witch hunts, which is going to be awesome. Jeff and Craig and Holly, our good friends, talking about Harry Houdini and some of the Halloween associations with him and the haunting associations with him. We've got Marnie and Caroline coming back on to do some astrology. So all kinds of great stuff coming up. So get all the information on our website, sixthsensesociety.com, SIXTH, all spelled out. And while you're there, if you can afford to, buy us a coffee on Ko-Fi. It helps to cover our production costs, and we do appreciate it. But the best thing you can do is click like and subscribe and tell your friends about us and help us grow our audience. That's the thing that makes us the most happy. So don't want to take up too much time, so I'm going to kick it back to Krista. So take it away, Krista.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And yes, thank you for putting up with our technical difficulties. So let me talk a little bit about why I decided to do this topic. First of all, I personally got interested in retrograde Mars when I discovered by accident the last time it was retrograde. It was, I think, in Taurus, and it was really affecting me. And when I looked it up, it helped me to understand what was going on. And I realized that I don't always personally pay attention to Mars in retrograde because it doesn't happen quite as frequently as Mercury. It's not talked about as much. And so it happens about every 2 years and 2 months, roughly. And it's the second least planet in retrograde, with Venus being the first. And then also, knowing the United States chart, I realized that Mars in Gemini, when it retrograde, could possibly really hit on the Mars in Gemini in the natal chart of the United States. And it does. In fact, today, there is an exact conjunction of the transiting Mars, which is still direct, conjuncting the United States Mars in Gemini and in the 7th house. And it's going to be also, there's going to be like a square this week too with Neptune. So I think it's going to be a pretty intense week, but I'll talk about that later. So that's a little reason why I wanted to jump into Mars in Gemini. And then it's also like literally sitting on my moon in Gemini. So I thought, well, maybe Mars wants me to talk about it. So since Gemini likes to talk. And so let's get going. So first, let me talk about sort of when this is all happening. We have... Now Mars entered the sign of Gemini August 21st, 2022, and it started in its shadow period for the retrograde September 4th, 2022 at 8 degrees 9 minutes of Gemini. And then it goes retrograde officially October 31st, Halloween, at 25 degrees 37 minutes. And then you're going to see it go direct January 13th, which is, by the way, Friday the 13th. I thought it was kind of interesting, at 8 degrees, 8 minutes of Gemini. And then finally, it's going to be through sort of the after period. I forget what that's called in astrology, but it's kind of through the whole cycle of retrograde on March 16th. When it moves into 25 degrees, 32 minutes of Gemini. So obviously it stays a lot longer in Gemini than it would if it was simply direct. So that's a little bit about the facts. So mark your calendars a little bit. Also, I personally think if you know your natal chart, it'd be interesting to see if it's actually hitting any of your planets significantly, whether it's an opposition or square or conjunction. One of the things I personally noticed is there's a lot of energy in this Mars in Gemini, and it can kind of go either way depending on how you use it. So let me get started on what I'd like to cover. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about the planet Mars. I don't think I've done that before on the show, what it is in your chart and what its functions are. We're going to talk a little bit about just the myth from the Western point of view, Western astrology point of view. I'm also going to go over a little bit more of the retrograde process itself, because I have been studying it off and on for about 4 years at different planets, doing different things. And there's not a whole lot of information on retrograde that has a lot of depth, but I have found some really good resources, about 3 or 4 different books I've been gleaming information from and studying. But what I think that a lot of people don't take the time to understand the retrograde process, because it's actually quite interesting, a little more complex, and it's not, simply everything slows down or you only look at the past or it's a problem. It's actually really different according to the planets, according to, I think, sort of like what stage of the retrograde process. You can break it down into stages, which I'm not going to have time to do on the show. So that's what we're going to cover. Then we're going to hopefully get into the Mars in Gemini retrograde, and then some thoughts about that, both for you personally and then hopefully for the United States chart. If I don't finish it now, I will certainly get to that next time. So the planet in Mars in mythology. In Erin Sullivan's book on retrograde planets, she often talks a lot about the mythology, like a lot of astrologers do in their books. So they give you some context as to why we see the planets this way. Certainly not the only way you can do it, but it's popular to do it. And so the Greeks saw, they didn't have a good view of Mars. They had the Greek god Ares, A-R-E-S, which became Aries, and he was 700 feet tall and threw tantrums in the bloody and battle-scarred fields of Troy. And he was a figure of infantile rage and uncontrollable lust. So this is a very primitive view of Mars. Then when you go to the Romans, they evolved Mars a little bit, and they also liked Mars, which we can understand why the Romans liked Mars, the god of war. But Mars was also associated with agriculture in the Roman view, and a patron of builders and craftsmen, and worshipped in many festivals in the month of March. He is also the father of Romulus and Remus, who supposedly founded Rome. So they had a different view. And Erin Sullivan thinks both views of Mars in your chart, that kind of infantile, raging Mars, and the more civilized Mars, which also can represent courage and asserting yourself, they are both functions in the psyche to be acknowledged and worked with and integrated. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we progress. So that's a little bit of view of the mythology, and then also the Amazons. The Amazon women worshipped Mars, which I thought does seem really appropriate. So then when she gets into a little more detail, Erin Sullivan, with the function of Mars, and I like this quote particularly from her book on retrograde planets. Quote, Mars attributes Eris, which is strife, and Kolos, rage, are commonly known, but there is an underlying theme of thumos, which is akin to what we call life force. Thumos is also will and desire, libido, resolution, mind, heart, sense, courage, spirit, passion, anger, wrath. And then she says that a little bit earlier, the drive towards experience and the will to power, and also the ultimate acquisition of a goal are all Mars functions. And I totally agree with that. In that longer description, when she talks about it being connected to the life force, it is that kind of energy that is connected to how you act in the world, get up and go. And so without Mars, nothing would happen, actually. And I like that in the definition, it sort of talks about desire, because there is this interesting connection with Venus, who I associate with desire, and Mars. And we'll see, there's certainly a strong mythological relationship, which you could also talk about. And then also Kabbalistically, there's this really interesting connection between Mars and Venus in the Kabbalah. So that's cool. And then Stephen Forrest, in his great book on the inner sky, he also talks about Mars as the development of will and the expansion of courage positively. And then negatively, he sees the dysfunction of Mars as touchiness, rage, selfishness, insensitivity, cruelty, sadism, bombast, irritability, a chip on the shoulder. And this concept of Mars and willpower, I think, is really, really important. I think that's one thing that you can look at, and also the ability to assert yourself in the world, which is part of will. And this Mars retrograde, depending on how it's going to affect your chart, can be helpful to know what area, what house it's going to be in, where you need to assert yourself, or maybe you're overly asserting yourself, where you might need to heal. So I personally like that idea of willpower with Mars and asserting yourself as being very, very important to talk about. Now, the retrograde process, as I've said before, it seems to be this really interesting process that basically any planet retrograde is somehow going to be aspecting the sun at the time. So it has this relationship with the sun, and the sun is sort of the ego. And of course, we're talking about the transiting sun, not necessarily, it might not have anything to do with your own natal chart sun, depending on what it's in. So I've talked about it before in the last show that we did with astrology. I talked about Martin Schulman's 3 phases of retrograde, which I probably won't go over again, but you can check it out in the last show I did with Caroline and Marnie. I've talked about it before. And basically, it's a more complex process as a result. And even Aaron Sullivan talks about looking at the different times of retrograde, like the first half versus the second half. There's different things to think about, and with all of the planets. One of the things is it does seem to be out of sync with time at different points, whether it's too far in the future or too far in the past. And we do seem to notice the past more. Perhaps it's because we want to sometimes use the retrograde to heal past lives even. So we're trying to bring those memories into the current present situation to heal. So I also, a long time ago, talked about Pathway to Ascension's look at retrograde planets. And like many astrologers, they think it's a more inward turning energy, and that they call them like they break the time barriers. I always love that. The idea of retrograde is breaking the time barrier. And the other thing, they think that you can be operating in multiple dimensions. And so there's this element of not kind of knowing where you are sometimes with the retrograde. And particularly if you have memories that come back from a previous life and you don't understand them. You don't know why you're having them through dreams or just sort of weird things and synchronicities. So just remember that in general, that seems to be part of the retrograde process, this sort of disorientation in time. And then you can sometimes define it more and get more particular when you know what planet it is that's in retrogrades, because it's a little different with each planet and sort of where it is in your natal chart. So that's a little bit about the retrograde process itself. And let's talk about a little more about Mars retrograde in Gemini in general, and not more from the point of view of how it's going to affect you personally. And then hopefully we'll talk a little bit about the US chart. So as I said, Mars is retrograde for not as often as, say, like Mercury, and it's approximately 9% of its cycle, which amounts to about 60 to 80 days every 26 months or so. And the one thing I like about some of the astrologers is they also, when they go to analyze different things, they'll tell you what the symbol for Mars or Venus means according to what they view the symbol of as. And Martin Schulman, in his book Karmic Astrology, he has this really interesting breakdown of the esoteric symbol for Mars, which most people know it's a circle with an arrow sort of slanting out to the side, and though there is an older one that has the cross above the circle. And I thought that was interesting to look at it to, again, get the idea of what Mars energy is in general versus the retrograde energy. And he said that for the symbol, he says Mars, the planet of vitality, energy, sexuality, and the desire for expression, is symbolized by the cross of matter angularly placed over the circle of spirit. In modern symbology, the cross appears as an arrow, thus indicating the Martian nature of thrusting forward. But it is of interest to note that the cross or arrow is always slanted, showing an imbalance as well as an incompleteness in this symbol. Thus, it thrusts outward, away from itself, as the cross or arrow accelerates away from the circle of spirit to find completeness in eternal things or other people. This is the only personal planet in which the cross of matter is placed above the circle of spirit. Thus, now this is really interesting, the need for carnal, material, and physical fulfillment takes precedence here over the spirit and can in fact fulfill the spirit. Interesting. He's saying that it's okay to want to fulfill certain desires through Mars. And what's interesting is in the Kabbalah, you have the Empress and the Tower as two of the three cards that basically are horizontal on the tree. There's only three cards that are, and we determined that the Empress and the Tower, along with the Strength card, is part of the creative cycle. And the Empress is Venus, and then in the card of the Empress is desire, and the Tower is Mars, action, something happens. And it's lower than the Empress. So the Empress starts, I have these desires, and then we skip the phase of the Strength card, which is committing to it. The Tower is when things are happening. So there's this idea that there can be something deeply spiritual about fulfilling our desires. So I really, really liked that line. I thought, yes, I totally agree with that too. Instead of thinking there's something wrong with it, or, you're only evil if you want that. Now, he says that when Mars is retrograde, he goes on to continue, the symbol's meaning becomes inverted, and the individual refuses to accept the fulfillment of his spirit by his achievements and conquests in the material or physical part of his life. From past incarnations, he has learned to sublimate, twist, deny, distort, or negate the fulfillment of his physical needs unless the needs of his spirit are met first. So that was interesting. It can be that you are still trying to resolve some needs from a past life, and particularly if you have this Mars retrograde always in your natal chart. But let's talk about a couple other thoughts about Mars retrograde too. So a new book I found called Your Hidden Powers by Joanne Wickenberg talks about retrograde planets as well as intercepted signs. And she says this really short line. She says, Mars retrograde provides a rare opportunity to redirect assertive power. Now, who doesn't need to do that at some point? So what you would want to do is say, hey, where is my Mars? What kind of sign is it in? And where do I need to redirect my assertive power? I personally, because this is a very personal experience for me, since I have the moon in Gemini, and I have some other aspects that are really, this Mars is touching. I have had a very powerful couple of experiences recently with being able to assert myself and inwardly feel calm and collected and not nervous, probably for the first time in my life. I have worked with asserting myself because I had some issues, and sometimes I wouldn't assert myself at all, and sometimes I would too much. But I've been working on it for many, many, many years. And so for me, this is kind of allowing some kind of culmination of an experience, because I'm not starting from the very beginning. I would say if you're a person that has issues with assertion, whether it's too much or too little, then I would say this could be a opportunity, but also really challenging, because it can be kind of all over the place. So just remember that. Because it really is some very powerful energy I'm finding for myself. And I don't think you have to necessarily even have to have, moon in Gemini or something else in Gemini to experience this energy, because it's going to be experienced collectively. So another thing she says about Mars in general retrograde is that once it enters the retrograde zone, which is not till the end of October, you begin functioning beyond your ability to assimilate, moving beyond consciousness. Because Mars energy is particularly volatile when it functions beyond the boundaries of consciousness, it opens the door to excessive stress and anxiety. And that, I think, is really important to notice because it's in the sign of Gemini, which can be connected to your nervous system. And I agree that it's going to heighten people that have anxiety already, or nervousness, or sleeplessness. That's going to be heightened. What I have found mentally too, it's making my mind super active. And it can be a little too much. So I'm going to say there's a couple of things I would suggest. One is be careful of too much caffeine. That's associated with the fifth Sephira, which is ruled by Mars. And trying to find some really mindless things to do sometimes that will just kind of calm the mind. Because even meditation might be difficult unless you've been doing it for a long time, but doing something kind of completely mindless, and that will kind of help give your mind a break. I've already kind of experienced that kind of sleeplessness and some weird sort of anxiety. So I would say that seems to be true from what I can tell. And then another thing she says that I thought was really interesting is Mars, due to its aggressive nature, challenges you to cease forging ahead to create new experiences on instinct only. Take time out to evaluate, come to terms with your masculine urges, aggression, sexuality, and passions. Consider potential outcomes of action and face the results or consequences of all action initiated since the previous Mars solar conjunction. So I think that makes a lot of sense too. And she talks about, Joanne Wickenberg talks about dividing the retrograde into two halves, with the first half where you're going to pull back your energy more and think about things. And the second half, which is going to be roughly, I think, around December 8th until it goes direct, you can start to really initiate more things. And I agree that it does seem like it's better not to start something brand new. You might be able to pick up from where you left off of at the previous retrograde cycle in Gemini, which was actually in 2008. I'll go over that a little bit later. But I think that that's a really good advice. I think that Mars and Gemini can cause people to actually speed, like literally. And so I think one of the antidotes always is to kind of slow things down a little bit, whether it's your thinking, your talking because of the Mercury aspect, or even your motion, like driving and things like that. I think that might be a good idea overall. But remember, like it might be a little bit difficult to relax, particularly as it's going to be like, particularly this week, because we're going to be squaring Neptune in Virgo. So that's going to cause a lot of tension overall. So that's a little bit about sort of Mars in, okay. Then I didn't mention Martin Schulman's idea of retrograde Mars. He also said it can cause, it can make you difficult to I can't even talk now, make it difficult to relax. So there's a couple of people that said that. I feel the same way. And then it causes, he says Mars retrograde in general causes feelings of guilt and blame, which isolate the individual, setting him apart from the free-flowing interchange of personal relationships that people with Mars direct do experience. And then he goes on to add that it can function in all three phases of the retrograde cycle. And one of the lines I really liked, he says that from previous lives, since retrograde can also be about past lives, he says, Mars retrograde people have to learn that the intense desires he sees in others are really his own. So if you find yourself projecting onto others who are doing things that you are not doing, that you want to do, let's say you're mad about it even, then pull back that projection and take a look at whether or not it's something that you want to fulfill in your life. I think that's really accurate from what I can tell so far from my own experience. The other thing I want to mention, I think we're probably just going to finish the rest of this retrograde in the next video I do for Spell It Out. So I did want to say that my feelings about Mars in Gemini and then the retrograde coming up, it doesn't have to be explosive. It doesn't have to be only about repressed anger, repressed volatility. Mars is a planet that, like, if you see it as a being, which I do, wants to evolve just like you do. So find a way to have a good relationship with the the things that Mars represents. And in a way, you are helping to evolve that planet. So if you do find that you have anger that comes out that you didn't even know you had at someone, do what Thich Nhat Hanh says to take 3 days before you actually do something with that anger, and see it as like a child. That's what I love about Thich Nhat Hanh. He says, like, see all your emotions as like a child. It's yours. It's not bad. You want to understand it and take the time, and you can have some insights. If you find you have memories that come out that are really frightening, you might want to reach out to someone or do a past life regression so that you can try again to understand it. One of the nice things I find about Mars in general in Gemini is it allows you to think quickly if you're trying to solve a problem. And so Mars, depending on, in my case, it created a problem in my life that I've had to adapt really quickly different ideas. And it's really great because it's in that mutable sign. And so that you can come up with solutions. If this isn't working, then that will work. So kind of wherever that Mars is kind of going to hit your chart, that's the area of your life it would show up. But as I said before, I will mention that because it's going to be in the 7th house in the United States chart, which is the house of relationship, and it's going to be also open enemies. So I think that can make relationships difficult right now for everybody, particularly because this week I said it's going to be squaring the Neptune in Virgo, which has an opposition in Pisces right now. So I am a bit concerned about fanaticism and also misinformation. We did talk about that on the last show, that it is possible there's more misinformation that comes out. But remember that if you are conscious about these things, you can work with it better. I'm not going to say it won't challenge you, because if I'm not challenged, then how can I draw on courage and learn to assert myself? And so the aspect of Mars being the warrior, I think, is across the board correct. And all warriors need some kind of challenge. And if you're a natural warrior, in some ways that might be a little easier for you. And if you're not normally a warrior, maybe you're going to need to draw on some of your warrior friends or the warrior strength in you. So to me, going in and saying Mars represents on a low level these infantile tantrums. So if you kind of feel you need to have a tantrum, just do it at home and you're on the floor in your living room or something crazy like that, or write a short story. In fact, writing, I think, could be really good with Mars, because it's an action, and Mercury, rules Gemini. So we like that. So doing something with it creatively, particularly writing, but definitely be a little careful with your communications with other people. If you suddenly feel angry at someone, even if it's deserved, just pull back a little and say, you know what? I'm going to cool this off with a little Venus energy, because Venus and Mars had a great love affair. So one of the things I have found is using my own Venus energy to kind of cool down the Mars, again, whatever makes sense for your particular chart. But they have a pretty interesting relationship and dynamic, and I think that's kind of a simple way to work with the overzealous Mars, the fiery nature of Mars too. But whatever you do, don't feel afraid of it. I think that that's not really helpful in general, and I would say that Mars will also give you the courage to face whatever Mars wants to bring to you. And then as a quick note, I'm going to be doing my first special ever I'm calling it a Mars Retrograde in Gemini. I'm going to start it probably November 1st and run it through at least the early part of January. And it's going to be a reading that I offer only during this time. And in this case, I would like to know your natal chart information, and I'm going to be working with tarot and astrology. So check out my website, mysticraven.net, to see when the special is and how much it is, and we can do a deep dive into your own Mars energy. Thank you for listening in. We're going to continue this discussion next time. Join us next time as we continue to explore the esoteric and the obscure together. Have a great week.